to this conversation today. My name is Caitlin Ryan, and I'm the Executive Director for the Cannabis Alliance, where we are dedicated to the advancement of a vital, ethical, equitable, and sustainable cannabis industry. We're here today in the interim to talk about legislation for the upcoming short session. What happens here in Washington, if you're not familiar, is we work on a biennium schedule, which means it's a 2-year session, I think is how we call it. It's a 2-year, legislative grouping. And the first year is always the longer one. We have about an extra month, and then we're coming up on the short session. So everything that was introduced in that first session is still alive in the second session, and there can be new legislation introduced. So today we're going to be focusing on the legislation that we know exists already from the last one, and then possibly some new ones that have bubbled up over this interim so far, and sort of where everybody's at. This group here, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'll have you introduce yourselves in just a minute. We don't all agree on all of the topics we're going to talk about today, and I'm looking forward to having that conversation about what points we don't agree on and why, so that folks who are watching can start to formulate their own thoughts about where we're at. For the purposes of the Cannabis Alliance, we'll be having our legislative survey coming out on Friday, and then on Thursday at our general meeting, we'll be having an open forum for conversation within our membership as we start to formulate our positions on these topics as we approach the legislative session. So having said all of that, I would love for you all to introduce yourselves. Micah, do you mind going first?
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm Micah Sherman. I'm one of the owners and founders of Raven, a Tier 2 farm in the Olympia area. And as well, I'm on the board of the Washington Sun and Craft Growers Association and lead up our policy there.
Thanks, Micah. Lucas.
Hi, I'm Lucas Hunter. I'm with Harmony Farms and have a background history of working within the belly of the beast over at the Liquor and Cannabis Board. That was 5 years ago now, though, and been over at Harmony ever since. I am also a part of Producers Northwest as well as the Cannabis Alliance.
Thanks, Lucas. And Lara, do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm Lara Kaminsky. I have been working with the Cannabis Alliance since its inception in 2016, first as its executive director and now as its government affairs liaison. So I have been involved in many of these conversations for a very long time.
Thank you. And then we have some guests that may be chiming in. Peter and Mike, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Peter Manning, Black Excellence of Cannabis, President.
Thank you.
Mike Asai, Vice President, Black Excellence Cannabis. Also, former dispensary owner, Emerald City Collective, first downtown Seattle. Unjustly shut down in 2016, looking to get back in. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you also for being here today. So as we were preparing to go live, I asked everybody how they felt about beginning with taxes, which is always a very fun, exciting place to start. However, you know, a lot of us sat through some hearings where we were listening to debates around alcohol taxes, and I now know more about that complicated system than I think I felt I needed to. However, I think it got some interesting conversations started. One of the big things we talk a lot about, right, is, well, we don't talk a lot about it. Other folks do, is potency. And so potency has been sort of a metrics possibility for taxation that's been around for a bit. There was a study a few years back, well, gosh, maybe about 5 years now, headed up by LCB regarding the possibility of that. It's come back into conversation as the prevention community has sort of put forward ideas about potency being harmful, and that taxation might be a way to address that. However, in the midst of that conversation, it sort of had us starting to look at different ways we might imagine our tax structure. Right now in Washington, we have, by a magnitude, I think, of 3, the highest excise tax out of any adult use state in the nation, which is really challenging. We know at the federal level, we also can't do anything there. And Representative Chambers put forward a bill, and as she introduced it in session, she said it was not so much the idea that she wanted to put forward that was written into the bill, but rather to start a conversation about how we might reform our thinking around cannabis taxes here in Washington state. I think everybody welcomes that conversation. However, once that welcoming happens, there's lots of divergent ideas on how we might begin to do that. And I'm sort of curious to hear from you all. What do you think about that?
Right
And
out the
yeah, go ahead, Lucas.
just right out the gate, obviously greatly in favor of reducing our effective near 50% tax that we have on cannabis products, 47-ish, right? With sales tax included on top of the 37% excise tax. The challenge I have is I've come to learn that the legislature does never remove total tax income. So if we were to change our tax structure to do it in such a way that we can hopefully lower taxes on some products, but effectively we will have to raise taxes on other products. And considering how the market has moved more away from flower products to further processed products, if that's, you know, joints, infused joints, if concentrates and vape cartridges, obviously. If we move to a tax structure that encompasses by THC potency, we're going to most likely increase our overall taxes that come into the state and raise the prices on the products that have the greatest market share. So I'm fully open to coming up with a good solution, but I would like to, how do we effectively lower our taxes on our incredibly high tax products, and not lower on some and then greatly increase on others?
Yeah, Lara.
Yeah, I think, you know, and this has been said several times. I hope it's been heard. When we're talking about taxing by potency, there is an underlying issue that's happening in the industry, whether we want it or not, that needs to be dealt with first, and that is accurate testing numbers. Before we even start to talk about taxing by potency, because if there's hijinks going on right now, going one direction, because we like the big numbers, if those big numbers start getting higher taxation, I guarantee you we're going to start seeing those numbers drop, and it's not because the actual reality of that number is dropping. So it's hard to talk about taxation by potency before we get that under order.
Yeah, definitely, Laura. I don't know if y'all are familiar with the in Japan automakers, there's a gentleman's agreement to limit horsepower back in the 90s. It's kind of a far-fetched one, but effectively everyone said, oh yeah, all of our cars make this much horsepower, and they made greatly more. I could totally see that being an advantageous thing in the industry to say, oh yeah, my vape cartridge is 60%, when in reality it's still going to hit quite harder. So just a nod to a historic event that I could see.
Well, and to that point, I sat in for part of, and there's going to be another one. Department of Ecology is holding some engagement around lab standards, which has been quite it's a many-year effort that seems to change shape year after year, and still I don't know that I walked away from that this morning with a lot of clarity. So I'm going to sit in on the second one, see if there's a little bit more that comes from that. Lara, can you speak a little bit to the expectations of those lab standardizations? I think 2024, right, is when we're supposed to have the recommendations.
So really what is happening, this came out of a series of different pieces of legislation in order to try to standardize labs, because we're seeing it's, you know, all over the map in terms of what labs are doing and how they're producing numbers. And one of the big challenges that was identified was the accreditation or oversight of these labs. So currently the LCB has hired a third-party auditor to come into the labs and take a look. And from the beginning, there has been concern with the effectiveness of this third party. And the LCB doesn't really know what they don't know in this realm. And so the legislation was trying to remove some of the oversight and responsibility of the LCB in this realm and hand it off to agencies that might have more knowledge, institutional knowledge. So that encompasses Department of Ecology, who does accreditation for laboratories and like water quality and, you know, things like that. And then also the Department of Agriculture, because they have their own lab that tests, you know, for agricultural products. So the idea was to kind of hand some of this off to these two agencies that have more understanding and inner working knowledge of managing labs. The idea was that the Department of Ecology would oversee the accreditation piece. So what that means is setting up very specific standards that the labs need to adhere to in order to then receive their accreditation or be able to test. And then WSDA would, so they would set the standards, and then WSDA would look at those standards and see how the lab is applying them. So the idea was to separate the two. So you wouldn't have the standard setting body and the overseer be the same, that they would kind of split. I don't know what's happening now with that. I think they're starting to merge that into possibly just being the WSDA, but in either case, that's where the conversation is. The hope being that we get better oversight of our labs. And they all have a standard by which they are testing instead of kind of a willy-nilly, sure, that looks like it works attitude.
Yeah. Oh yeah, go ahead, Micah.
Yeah, so just to sort of circle back to the taxes issue, like obviously the accurate testing for potency would be a prerequisite for any sort of plan that sought to do that. And I think that a really important thing to keep in mind is that while it is true that the legislature is hesitant to give away revenue, it's not entirely impossible that a close to tax neutral rearrangement could result in lower taxes. I don't think that's impossible for a couple of reasons. One is one of the logics of legalization was to bring the illicit market into a regulated market. And the 37% tax on flour is going to always be a barrier to flour producers being able to compete on price equality with the illicit market. And we've seen that come back up lots in the last few years. I think we've seen a real resurgence in small scale, illicit market again. And so I do think that we have an argument to make about reducing the excise tax for that reason, because they're legally, responsible for making a situation that the most people will come in and participate in the regulated market. And I think we need to just keep in mind that that's something that we still need to do. Like we haven't successfully brought in enough folks into this industry yet to have anywhere close to achieve that. So I do think we have that argument on our side. And that is a compelling argument for a lot of reasons: public safety, public health, law enforcement. Like all of these are costs that if we can make our industry more appealing to everybody to participate in, we might have a chance of winning them over to being participants in the legal market. And I do think we're going to see price pressure across state lines with differing tax rates as interstate occurs. So there's going to be lots of moments where we can push for that. So I think having a coherent framework of like, why do we have these taxes? Should they be the same across all product categories? Is the state's responsibility for creating rules and regulations equal for flour as for processed products? I would say no. So I think a higher excise tax on those uncertain products that are new, that are novel, that need research, that need understanding. There's a logic to say that like, a high rate on concentrates and processed products might make sense, and probably is going to have less of an issue of pushing those products into the illicit market, because it's obviously a lot more complicated to like run a lab and make edibles and infusions and all of that at scale and in a way that's cost efficient than it is to just grow flour. So it's a lot harder for the illicit market to compete on price on some of those more highly processed products than it is just straight flour. So there are places where we can push and pull on that. And I do think a successful result of this would be similar rates of taxation for processed products, lower prices, lower taxes on flour, And one thing that I've always hoped we could get to is a tax on milligrams for edibles, because I think having a 37% excise tax that applies to all of the ingredients of an edible, as well as the THC, disincentivizes people from using quality ingredients in edibles. And I think we've seen that. We've seen a sort of flattening of the quality of a lot of those products over the years, where we used to have lots of these sort of interesting boutique products that people put a lot of energy into, and then just couldn't sustain that with the amount of taxation on all those non-cannabis ingredients that's included. So I do think there's a good argument there to be made to go to milligrams. So while and then all this to say, I don't think that like legislatively this is something that's like on the horizon anytime soon, but I do think it is like interesting for us as an industry to start having these conversations about where can we push and pull on these taxes, and how can we use them to like make things better in particular ways. And yeah, we're always going to have to struggle with the like battle for the budget, but anything we can do to like bring more folks in from the illicit market into the regulated market is going to bring that tax base up. And so if we can start to try to figure out how to do that at the same time as we lower taxes, it can be revenue neutral and lower rates. And I do think us eventually getting to a point where it's just as easy and you're just as successful participating in the regulated market as the illicit market, that's going to be like the sign of success. And we're a long way off from that. So
yeah, thanks, Micah. Mike and Peter, and then Laura.
All right, thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, I just had a question in regard to the tax. So I know, okay, someone can help me out, so I can't really quite remember. 2014, when retail first started, I know there was a big issue about the tax. So if someone could just help my memory, what happened when, because it was a certain tax, and then people were complaining, because I remember an eighth was like $65 or something like that, right?
Yeah,
So
it was a tiered taxation. There were like 3 different places for taxation to kind of occur.
okay,
And so then what ended up happening, it was like at the producer processor stage, and the processing stage, and then the retailer stage, there were like all these different taxes, and it was insane.
right.
And kind of based on the alcohol market, how they do things. But we're so unique, whatever, it didn't work. And so they collapsed it all down into one tax at retail of 37%.
Okay, so was that done legislatively, or that was, okay, that was kind of what I was wanting to know. Okay, thanks, Laura.
Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, I just wanted to, you know, kind of, you touched around it, Micah, the legislative hurdle when we start talking about lowering taxes and it bringing in customers that may not be currently accessing the regulated market. And it's such an incredibly difficult conversation to have with the legislature, because they do not look at elastic fiscal notes, right? They only look at the black and white of things. And what if we put forward a bill that's going to lower taxes, all they are able to show is how much money that's going to take out of the government's pocket. They can't say, oh, and ideally it's going to bring in X number of consumers into the market that are not currently there, so that balances it out, and here's this number. Like they can't do it. And so then all the legislators see is this very red big number of loss. And I don't personally know how to get around that challenging piece of the legislative puzzle, because it's you know, whatever that organization that does all the fiscal notes, right? Like I think we've all experienced challenging fiscal notes in one way or another, and it's incredibly difficult to talk about a revenue neutral approach when we're just showing them reduction of taxes. That's all.
Well, and hopefully, you know, one of those ways, just recently talked with JLARC, joint legislative something taxes. It is
audit review.
Okay, something. It is the bipartisan staff only group associated with the legislature that essentially studies revenue and how revenue is generated and the ins and outs. They've done a few studies over the years regarding cannabis, and right now part of 5080, which is a social equity in cannabis bill that was passed at the end of this last legislative session. The mandate is to look at supply and demand. And so some of, I think, the things that we're dancing around, this is one of the ways that we're all going to benefit is from the study of what supply and demand looks like. And hopefully that's going to include the interaction of the unregulated market and how that might be impacting in taxes. Another little piece of things, Larry, you mentioned how challenging it is to get the legislature to let go of some of that revenue. And that's the other little piece of taxes I want to talk about before we move on to our next subject. And that is removing the excise tax for patients purchasing DOH compliant product here in Washington State. It's a bill we've been working on now for about 5 years. It feels like a no-brainer. You all, I'm sure, have been in the room when there's been testimony. It is powerful testimony to listen to. This is a very small number of people purchasing products that are only produced by 4 producer processors here in Washington State with very few SKUs on the shelves. The fiscal impact is minuscule. I believe budget dust is the word that I have heard used more than once, yet somehow it keeps getting thwarted in odd and interesting ways. Lara, do you want to talk a little bit more about that bill, and just kind of want to hear everybody else weigh in on that one too?
Yeah, I mean, this one it's close to home. Like, this is one that I care very deeply about. You know, going back historically, you know, patients really got screwed with the introduction of the regulated market, and in more ways than one. And the idea that they have to come in and pay almost 40% on medicine is just wrong. And it keeps them from engaging. The other piece of the bill is that, you know, it's really trying to incentivize producers to create higher quality, higher tested products for those patients that we know have, you know, more, you know, they're compromised. They need really clean, good products that they know what's in it. It's very, you know, very important. So it's kind of a double-edged thing, but specifically focused on patients and providing them with more access in the regulated market. And yeah, it does seem kind of like a no-brainer. As far as I can tell, the entire industry is behind it, which is rare. But even with that support, you're right, it keeps getting stopped in the same spot. So we're thinking that it's not really about the actual policy, it's more about historical bias and with the industry, that people are going to somehow game it, which is literally impossible. You know, just people who in the legislature, I think, still feel that this isn't something that they want in their communities, and this might open a door even bigger. I don't know. So we're still working on it. But honestly, if I can make a call out to anyone who's listening to this, next session, when it starts and we start getting hearings, I just would love to see a huge response. Have lots of people in the room. You don't necessarily need to testify, but we need to be visibly clear that this is important to us, and that really there's no downside. So I don't know if that's what you wanted. I'm very passionate about it.
No, that's okay. Well, and to your point around that call to folks, I mean, that's how we got arrest protection passed. So as of the 23rd of July, patients don't have to get arrested first and then defend themselves later. Police have to prove that there's a reason why that is happening in the beginning. And I think that also was a no-brainer. People were shocked that wasn't already the case, but now that is the case. And we're going to need that same kind of support to get the excise tax across. Mike and Peter.
Where did it get, Laura? Where did it get stopped at? Like, what part of the legislation was it in?
Appropriations. And so historically, what we've done is we've started the bill in the Senate with Karen Kaiser. She's been actually a great champion. We get it all the way through the Senate. Every year that we got it out of the Senate, it's actually passed with larger and larger margins in favor. And then it gets over to the House. It goes through its policy committee and gets voted. This time, I think it got voted out unanimously in favor, gets to appropriations and dies every single time. So this year we started it in the House, hoping that we could, move it through, knowing that if it got through the House, the Senate was going to pass it. Still died in appropriations.
What was it, the bill number?
1453.
1450. Thank you.
And you may have to check with me
I'm
later.
confirming. Yes, 1453.
2 for 2 today, Caitlin.
I know, you're on a roll, man. Lucas, it looked like you had a thought there.
Yeah, one of the narratives that I caught on to last session was a concern that the system would be gamed and we would see a substantial increase in medical cannabis patients, and that would decrease overall tax revenue for the state. And right now, there's very little financial incentivization for a company to make medical cannabis products because it's such a basically, I want to say it was like 2% of total sales, like just dismal. So to make special products for patients and to pay for the DOH certification with increased testing costs, it just wasn't, it's not financially incentivized. So the concern is if we have if we were to alleviate taxation on medical cannabis products, all of a sudden that would be a new booming part of the market, and we would see cannabis tax revenue decrease. So I'm not sure if it's worthwhile to get ahead of that and do a study. I imagine that's what you're want to talk about, Laura. And
well, so yeah, and beyond that, I think, it's continuing to educate, right? Like because we're not only talking about being a qualified patient, we're talking about being a registered patient. So these are people that have gone the additional step and actually registered in the database, which is already going to keep people from participating just on its face, but it's not easy. None of these steps are easy. It is incredibly difficult to become a qualified patient and a registered patient. There's all kinds of challenges within the system. So we've tried to educate, and that's just not getting through. So one of the things that we are working on, and Caitlin's really been instrumental working on, is doing a cost comparative report where you can see the cost of DOH products compared to other products and how they're way more expensive. So even with the reduction in the tax, they're not going to be the cheapest thing on the shelf. They're going to be in line, which is, fine for patients. They don't want to be spending more though, right? And so somebody who's a recreational person, if they just want cheap weed, they're going to be able to get cheap weed without having to go through all these steps and hurdles that are actually going to be impossible for them to get through unless they're actually a patient. So we're trying to illustrate that a little bit more and hand it in advance of these conversations.
And yeah, as Laura's indicating, this is a much deeper conversation that opens another can of worms on the regulatory side of things. If you would like to check out our YouTube channel, we have a whole interview with John Kingsbury, who has done an even deeper dive into this, entitled "The Collapse of the Medical Market in Washington State." And you can kind of take a look at some of the research that he's been doing, and yeah, a lot of good, interesting information there. Before we started, I commented that we have enough on our list. We could talk for 4 or 5 hours, and gosh darn, we're already a little bit behind on all the things I wanted to talk about. So I would love to move forward from here into, let's talk a little bit about agriculture before we then move on to some of the business minded bills that we have in front of us. We have been working on a Cannabis Research Commission bill for 7 years-ish. Yeah. a while. And you know, it's been a bit of a challenge because it is asking for an assessment on the industry, which can feel not great, especially on the heels of this tax conversation that we just had, and on the fact that in a lot of ways we are still looked at as criminals who are allowed to stand in the room, not even sit at the table. And so it can feel really crummy to say to all of our licensees, hey, can you pony up some additional money to pay for this much needed research? Now, we believe that the amount that we have talked about is pretty small and the return would be huge, particularly had we been able to get this through in early days. I think could have been a critical mitigator of some issues that have come up in the last couple of years, not the least of which the Brewster situation, which you can also find a great conversation on our YouTube channel about that specifically. And that the DDE situation happened at the end of April. So I remember there's like 2 weeks of the legislative session left, enough that there was a small amount of money that was put into the budget to help with relief for some farmers, but it certainly opened up a broad conversation around who regulates the practice of growing these plants here in Washington state. There are folks at LCB that have pretty strong opinions that no matter what, this is a regulated substance and should belong under the purview of LCB no matter what. I think there are some farmers who really wish that WSDA had been in charge as we went through the DDE process. We know that there is going to be some legislation put forward around moving regulation of agricultural practices under the WSDA. We at the Cannabis Alliance have actually put forward some legislation in the past, and we are relooking at that around maybe a redesignation again around some of these practices as agriculture, with a mind to the taxation issue that brings up. That's a long-winded introduction. Kind of curious what you all think about cannabis as ag, or even just more simply putting some of that regulation under the purview of WSDA instead of LCB. Michael, why don't you go first?
Yeah, happy to hop in. So yeah, our organization is fully supportive of efforts to bring the WSDA more directly into the regulatory process as it relates to not the aspects of controlling cannabis that the LCB does, but sort of all of the other things that they do in regards to the production process. So for me, it's everything from, you know, rules about canopy to what products are made to, you know, grow practices to, you know, essentially like all of the things that are about the production of plants and all of that, you know, pesticides, testing, the whole gamut, you know, get all of that into their purview and leave the control issues to the Cannabis Control Board, as it were, even though they don't have that in their name anymore or whatever. But I still think of them as the control board, and I think that's a good role for them. And I think that there's still relevant parts of the production process that they would be involved in. But I think there's an awful lot of stuff that we would benefit from having, you know, our ag agency in the driver's seat. So I don't see it as all as like there's a conflict on that point of concern that you brought up about, you know, controlling the product and making sure that the LCB is in the role for that, which I think both of those things are able to be done simultaneously. And there's a lot of benefit to having ag more involved. One of which is just cross-agency transparency. Agencies tend to be more concerned about their peers than they are about how we feel about them. And you know, they can sort of dismiss our concerns in a way that is much harder for them to do with folks that work at other agencies that are kind of on the same level. And I do think that is something that would benefit us as an industry, is to having you know, the ability to talk to more than one agency about some of these things and get some benefit from that we don't have. I do think that that's something that it both adds a level of complication, which is a potential risk, but it also creates a level of transparency about some of the decision making that I think we don't always get great insight into. So I think there's a lot of benefits. The other aspect of all of this is as we move into regulated interstate markets, a lot of other states have their ag agency involved. I think there's benefits for us in that arena as well. And so I want to bring in the mentality and the resources that they have at ag, which is a lot more focused on the economic success of the folks that they're working with. They're supporting farmers, whereas we have an agency that is not statutorily obligated to support our economic interests, that are in charge of how we're able to run our farms. And that for me is the big difference there, is that the Department of Agriculture has some statutory authority that directs them to be concerned about the outcomes to their farmer or to the folks that they're regulating, whereas the LCB has to consider it in a analysis, but they don't need to use that analysis to inform their rulemaking, because their priority is public safety and control. And so that is a difference between those two agencies. And I think that there's lots of opportunity to bring in the advantages of ag without running up against the concerns of, you know, just everybody is going to have free cannabis falling off the side of the road.
Right.
So,
Lucas.
yeah, I don't know what, like, there's obviously the Liquor and Cannabis Board historically does not understand how cannabis is grown. I mean, there's one of my last jobs there was direct proof of that, told to go measure every cannabis plant in the state. And how is it grown was an afterthought. So there's no secret that they're heavily aware of treating us like an analog to liquor in just the distribution and sale of a finished product. But the actual cultivation of the product is something that they do not understand. Department of Agriculture, I think, would be a far better suited agency to look over that. My concern is, what can of worms are we opening up? Because I mean, historically, the Liquor and Cannabis Board has done a complete bogus job, to use politically correct language, of working with Department of Health as far as any sort of interagency conversations. And recently with Department of Agriculture, there's a whole push for pesticide testing and assessment of what pesticides you're using by having someone drop on by to various farms throughout the state. And there's really, I haven't seen any sort of nexus that's been substantive between the agencies, and a history of not doing a good job with it. Obviously, there's certain things that we need to brace for. The big one that I've been looking into is good manufacturing practices. The cost that will bring to our industry, something that we will have to do the moment that we have federal decriminalization. However, something that we don't have to pay for necessarily right now. For the greater good in the long run, totally. But that's a huge shift that we're looking at. So as we move forward with the idea of moving regulation over to WSDA, where it rightfully so belongs, I think really outlining within the industry and having discussions about what do we want that mandate to be? What is that going to look like? What are the benefits? Because in my head, I keep on running through scenarios where I'm like, well, what sort of storm are we bringing upon us as far as an agency that has been lackadaisical with hemp regulation, agency that doesn't have a deep-rooted history in cannabis, and not saying Liquor and Cannabis Board is great, but they at least vaguely, they've heard our gripes over the past 12 years. So my only concern is, what's the direction that we're looking to give when moving over to Department of Agriculture, and that we are fully aware within industry and have our narrative aligned across different trade associations as to why is this a good thing, and what sort of benefits are going to outweigh the cons. So more of a bigger discussion.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting counterpoint. You know, having that conversation with some folks at LCB, and you know, the comment was, you know, I guess the grass is always greener on the other side. And you know, to your point, Lucas, I think it is wise for us as we start making some of these requests to at least look at it, that we look at potential unintended consequences. I think that observation around hemp is a really important one, and one that we need to be really cognizant of as we look at that structure. However, Micah, to the point that you just made regarding interagency accountability, I think would be great. You brought up the Department of Health, but then even our beginning conversation about Department of Ecology and the interagency collaborative team that seems to not actually be materializing. And that level of collaboration, I think, helps us as those being regulated, and I think could be a broad benefit. Micah, you've brought up oh, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I just had one thing to say on that, that you reminded me of, the idea of these agencies collaborating with regulation of our industry. There's a lot of these agencies that have never had to work together before until us. So, they don't know how to talk to each other. Like, we might love it, like, oh, you guys are regulatory agencies, just talk to each other. But some of them don't have those channels. They've never had to develop them before. Liquor and Cannabis Board with DOH, what? And ecology now involved, and so it touches on every single regulatory agency in our state, and those channels aren't necessarily there. And so I think, to your point, Lucas, kind of helping shape how those conversations should ideally go. You have control over here, you have control over here. This is why, and this is how you can benefit each other. Is a big part of the conversation that we need to have, not just, yeah, you take that. Great.
Almost like defining the nexus points between the agencies. And I don't know if it's too much to put statutory language around that, of where the baton is handed off from one to the next.
My understanding of that process is ongoing right now between Ag and LCB in an effort by a legislator to draft this bill. So this bill is being written right now, and there will be a moment after the agencies review and give feedback that we'll get to see the results of that. And so I think that this idea that we're talking about is going to be an elongated process of discovering those points, figuring out exactly how a transition would occur. So I don't have a lot of concerns that anything like this will happen very quickly, and we're not going to get like steamrolled by some mysterious 11th hour sort of thing. Like, this is going to be very slow. It's going to take a long time, and I do think the points that you bring up are very valid, Laura. But and I think a lot of that is the LCB hasn't really needed to do that sort of interagency work in the past, whereas the other agencies have. And so I think part of it is, breaking that barrier, which we've already started to do a little bit. The other thing I want to sort of say about all of this is, I mentioned this in the tax conversation, but like, there's different types of products, there's different types of things we do. And one of the things that we can get out of a lot of these conversations and the sort of normalization process is, we can identify the things in our industry that don't need the level of scrutiny and control that they have now, and start to ease some of that back, to lower our compliance costs, to lower our regulatory burdens. And a lot of that is going to be on the plant side of the equation, because up until the point that the plant is finished, cut down, it's not a usable cannabis product, until that point. So there's an awful lot of stuff we do to control a plant that's technically hemp for 90% of its life, or maybe not 90, 70% of its life or whatever. And this is one of those arenas where we're going to be able to start to say, like, this is the moment where it really starts to matter that this thing is super controlled. And that's where the higher burden starts. And before that point, we can start to lower the burdens that we're accountable to, because there isn't the sort of public health and diversion concerns until that moment. So I do think starting to think about, where can we realistically, with support of legislators and the LCB and the regulators, reduce the burdens that we're under. And that would actually reduce the burdens for the LCB as well, because we know that they're struggling with enforcement. They can't hire enough officers. They have too much work to do. So what's the sort of work that they're doing that's not necessary that we can both remove for their benefit and for ours? There's a lot of places where we can work together with them, I think, to make all of our jobs easier, bring our costs down, and make this thing a little bit more sustainable. Because like the way that we're doing things right now, in my opinion, is not sustainable in the long term relative to the rest of the country. And we are going to need to start doing some things to lower those compliance costs in order to be relevant. And I do think that there's support on both sides for doing some of that.
Yeah. One more thought on this, Lara, and then I'd like to move on to some business
I
legislation.
was just gonna say, I mean, related to this idea of like, you know, being a plant and then becoming more of a manufactured product. That's one space that, you know, the Alliance started quite a while ago, and we're looking to possibly pick back up again, is this designation in the tax code that we are not agriculture, which, you know, was a temporary thing, supposedly, while they were trying to understand the industry. It is now well beyond that temporary piece. So I think that's kind of part and parcel of what you're talking about, Micah. This, you know, up to a certain point, it is ag. It should be treated as ag. We should get some of the benefits of ag, which is, you know, tax exemptions in certain spaces, until it gets to a certain point when it is a regulated and controlled product that is for the adult use market or patients or whatever it may be. So I just want to pop that in.
Yeah, thank you, Lara. And so I think that actually leads really nicely into sort of the final large section that I want to talk about as we're getting close to time here. And that is, Micah, you've mentioned a couple of times out of state interstate commerce, which was a bill that we worked on collaboratively that passed the legislature. So we are now set up to possibly, if there is a triggering event, begin to have conversations about what interstate compacts might look like before federal legalization. And we're working with a couple of West Coast states to begin those conversations, particularly as more Middle America and East Coast states come online and are going to need more product than they're really capable of producing. And we here on the West Coast have the best weed. So hopefully we can look at that. And that's one of those things that no matter where you are in the licensing process here in adult use, is just good fundamental infrastructure that is necessary for doing business. And a lot of the things that we're talking about are kind of broader, big ideas that I think are having a sight towards exactly that, to sort of untangle some of the mess that we made by being one of the first states to legalize that really have not received a lot of attention. One thing that continues to be a hot debate, and we'll get to out-of-state ownership, is exactly that. In the beginning, not only were we not allowed to have out-of-state ownership, but we didn't have out-of-state investment. A few years back, that changed a little bit, and I cannot remember if that was legislation or not.
It was 5284.
There you go. It was. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, Micah. Now, one of the big things that has happened with this last legislative session was the passage of 5080, which are social equity licenses. LCB, prior to that legislation, also had begun a process of releasing some licenses. So over the next 5 years or so, we're in the first set of retail licenses, the application process. We haven't had any come to fruition yet. The application process just closed a couple of months ago. So there are quite a few folks in process currently. Then there will be another set of retail licenses released as well as a part of that legislation. And then ostensibly, possibly up to 10 licenses for producer processors as well. With that, comes an interesting piece of conversation, because we've talked about 5052 a little bit when we were talking about the excise tax and how patients have been sort of left out of things. Along with that also came some injury on social equity. There was how do I want to say this, sort of misinformation about that process of folks who are part of the legacy market or that medical market, which was promised would not be touched, was basically obliterated by 5052. And with its demise, we lost a lot of our owners and operators of color. If you've been a part of any of the social equity and cannabis task force conversations or the listens and learns with Liquor and Cannabis Board, you know that there was considerable harm done. And while there is effort to right some of that harm, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done. And the least of which is that we actually need to see some of these licenses open and in operation. In that context, also, we have independent owner operators here in Washington state at a rate that we don't see in any other state in the nation, that has concern about out-of-state ownership coming in. Mergers and acquisitions are up significantly within the cannabis space across the country. And there's concern that that might also be the case if we open up for out-of-state ownership here in Washington state. I'm presenting these sides of things within the Cannabis Alliance. We've traditionally had all opinions and in enough of a way that it's been really challenging to say we as an organization stand in one spot or another. So I think it's important that we have a variety of voices talking about this, and we'll continue this conversation, like I said, in our general meeting on Thursday. So if we don't get to touch on all the points, don't feel too frustrated. This is going to be an ongoing conversation. I am interested in, let's see, and how do I want to say this? I personally, traditionally have felt that out-of-state ownership needs to wait a bit. I do, however, see now on the landscape, and I've had this conversation with you all individually, I'm almost looking at it as a harm reduction perspective, right? That perhaps right now would be the least impactful moment. I don't know, though. Does that mean right now this year, or does that mean in the next 3, 4, 5 years to allow, like I said, for those social equity licenses to have the opportunity to become actionable and enjoy maybe some of the same sheltering that other licenses have enjoyed for the last 10 years. Lucas, I see you're ready to go. Go for it.
Yeah, I think everyone knows I've been pretty passionate about this. And all the way back from my time in adjudication at the board when Vice came out with the article that Northwest Cannabis Solutions Holding Company had done a reverse merger with a company on the Canadian Stock Exchange and was getting out of country funding in the state. And bringing that to each of the board members and saying, what the heck? And we're not moving forward on any of that. Since then, we've had a number of other large entities within the state of Washington do similar acquisitions, reverse mergers with the Canadian Stock Exchange to have out of country money come in. That's action by the holding company using a cannabis company as a subsidiary due to a lack of subpoena authority the Liquor and Cannabis Board has over cannabis licenses, and provides an inability for the Liquor and Cannabis Board to look into those holding companies. So we've effectively allowed out-of-state ownership for the rich and prohibited out-of-state ownership for anyone that doesn't have $1 million+ to set up a holding company that can acquire these funds. So I really see this as a leveling of the playing field, where we currently have an inability for someone to go reach out to their family member in Kansas and be able to get an additional, let's say, $50K or greater as a capital investment into our companies. Now, the misnomer here is technically allowed to do that, but you can't provide equity for those investments, and no one in the right mind is going to invest realistically $1 million into a cannabis business without having a little bit of skin in the game. So any company that's set up a holding company that can then do through lease agreements, through branding right agreements, or various other means of having intellectual property as the keepsake that can go to that out-of-state entity, there's opportunities for those. But once again, those are for the very few that have the capital to undergo that sort of business structure, right? So when I see this, it's providing I think it needs to happen 5 years ago, because we already have this great injustice of people having like capital come in. I mean, Just the other day, I saw a Cookies bus driving down the street. Cookies is an MSO, and there's clearly branding funding that's going to come in and assist that one retail chain, right? So I would hope that we could pass this bill. I drafted a version of it 2 years ago now. There's a portion of the bill that would allow for minor ownership to not be vetted by the board. If that needs to go, that's fine. I personally see it as a way for a company to be able to give stock to individual employees because we can't do regular retirement funds. So being able to provide stock options. And also at this point, Washington is one of the most undervalued states for cannabis investment. And it's largely in part due to the regulatory red tape around having funding come in from out of state. So by making that 10%, the 10% clause also would make Washington attractive for out-of-state entities to come invest in us, where right now we're pretty much a laughing stock of the country when it comes to getting any sort of investment or IP interest or anything along those lines. So I really hope that this is something that we can all come around together. It sits in rules over in the Senate. So, and I would think we'll move through the Senate and then we'll be moving it through the House. It's a highly controversial issue. We've run into that year after year after year. But my concern is if we don't get ahead of this and get our companies the funding that they need to grow to be on par with other companies from out of state or other MSOs, we're going to see an extinction of Washington-based cannabis companies that don't have that higher entity structure that allows for out-of-state IP, out-of-state funding, or whatever to come into the state, whether it's a Cookies, whether it's a Wild, whether it's a Northwest Cannabis Solutions, or whatever. I really think we need to make the change to allow for this intellectual property and the funding to be able to make its way into the state. And hopefully we can come up with safeguards to prevent licenses from getting gobbled up and blown up into, a big fat panda, for instance, because state capital comes in, gets a cheap license and throws money at the wall. So I mean, that's
No,
that's a lot.
and so yeah, I think that sort of gets to the question that we're grappling with, right? This feels like a very existential one, and the question is out-of-state ownership, I think right now, good business foundation that everybody benefits, including brand new licenses coming online right now, or is this a market moving forward yet again, leaving social equity behind?
I would personally think the startup capital required to be competitive with neighboring stores, and I'd love to hear Mike and Peter Manning's comments on this, but the capital it takes to start up a retail store is incredibly intensive, and especially to be competitive with neighbor retail stores, especially with a predatory history on the retail side as far as deals and discounts and whatnot. I would hope that this would help the success of social equity applicants. But please, Peter and Mike.
Yeah. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure exactly when or how long this out-of-state investment has been an issue with white retailers or white stakeholders, but I know I became aware of it in 2019 when we started sounding the alarm that there was the Washington cannabis industry, there was no Black or brown inclusion. And see, you guys got to look at one thing. It's no different than when when Black people or brown people move into the neighborhood, predominantly is white people have a tendency to sell because they think somehow that's going to drive down the value of their property. So given that, from how we look at it, we've always looked at it this way when we speak of out-of-state investment, as now that we're coming into the market, they want to devalue it by getting out-of-state investment. Social equity applicants or stakeholders will not be able to compete with the industry that they're learning that white stakeholders have had the last 10 years to master and to maneuver around. If this is where I'm going, if the only way that's going to be that's going to taste good to our palate is if I don't even know what that even looks like, because we're so far removed from where you guys are at, from your talking points. We can't even see out-of-state investment because we haven't even seen equity. So our organization at this point, there's no way we could support that with a clear conscience, especially now with the argument that he just laid before us. Because that's has a self-interest of white ownership. It doesn't include us even in the thought process. Because you guys should be considerate of how we're looking at it. And that, if you truly believe in your heart that that's the right thing to do, you're going to have to look at it through the lens of social equity, because that's the only way you're going to see it to where it would work to benefit us as well as you. The way you're creating it now and the argument you're raising now is most definitely not going to fly with us. And I'm not, I want to work with everybody. Like I said, we're solution based, but truth to power people, we couldn't support that.
And I just want to just chime in and piggyback a little bit on what Peter's saying. It's like he said, it's a form of redlining in essence. You have social equity, Black and brown coming in, and there's this big notion about out-of-state investing. And I do understand. We're looking at it from the retail side. Obviously, we're not looking at it from the producer or processor side, but from the retail side, you have a lot of retailers that have 3 to 5 locations. And, if an out-of-state investor, someone from Canada, a big stock broker from New York, they have the money to come in and buy 10 locations. So they can buy this 5 and that 5. And then you have social equity that's a small business owner that only can apply have 1 license. Where does that fit, right? And looking at it as far as, then you can have someone that has 10 locations, and then now social equity is going to be forced, applicant or retailer is going to be forced to either sell or have that investor come in. And it just doesn't feel right for us, just because there's been this 10-year head start. But as Peter said, we're solution-based, and we have some ideas that maybe we won't provide that today, but we maybe have some ideas going forward, because obviously we know this is not going to be an issue that's going to go off the table. We understand that California and other states are allowing for out-of-state investing. If that was something from the onset, then hey, maybe we would be having this conversation, right? But the fact that it's like, here we are with social equity, as we've stated before, we got to get social equity going before we talk about out-of-state investing, because what we see with out-of-state investing is the same thing that we saw with Senate Bill 5052. There was this notion that we needed to do this and do it this way, but then it was the complete opposite of what was stated. So understand that Senate Bill 5052 put me as the first downtown Seattle dispensary that paid taxes, did everything right, but it put me in a position where I didn't get a license, and I didn't do anything wrong except for be fully transparent. And so anyway, just wanted to just
it's a hard sell, you guys, to our community, and you guys got to look at it like we look at it. Imagine you're going to start a mom and pop store in your neighborhood, and then Walmart decides to move in next door to you. So it doesn't sit well with the palate.
And let me just say this: it's kind of there's an example out there with the liquor. Liquor was controlled by the state.
Yeah.
And then people thought they were going to have an opportunity to be able to now get their own personal liquor store. But then the big conglomerates came in: Costco, Total Wine, Bevmo. So then it put a lot of, because we've heard stories where people had got a license, but
put everything into it.
They never could open up. Yeah. So
they're barely surviving now.
Yeah.
And,
or some had to close or just couldn't even compete. So
yeah. So we got to, let's try to do something different. If you guys really want to try to get this to work, we got to come together and collaborate on something that's a little bit better than that. Luca's his presentation. You guys can do whatever you want. We couldn't support that version of it.
Yeah. Lara, then I have a question and I'll let you follow up there, Lucas.
Yeah, I mean, I think overall, what I continue to hear in this conversation, which is, why from the Alliance's perspective, it's been really hard to 100% get behind it or 100% not, is the question of unintended consequences. Are we seeing, I mean, traditionally, this industry is incredibly good at finding the loophole, right? To the detriment of people who are following the rules, who are trying to do it right, who are smaller, whatever. They don't have a bevy of lawyers in their back pocket. They lose every time. And so I think if we're being honest with ourselves about approaching this conversation, we need to be honest with ourselves about where can somebody game this? Where is somebody who is not going to be a stand right up, citizen, and just wants to gather it all for themselves? How are they going to do it with the language that we've got in front of them? Because they'll find a way. And I think that, that's always been the scary part. We want to create an environment here in Washington state that is enviable, that where we do have diverse representation, that we do have incredibly diverse product selection that serves a multitude of consumers, right? Like that's an enviable market. And I am concerned that we get really worried about being left behind. So we start doing things that end up undermining our overall goal as a state. So just unintended consequences. I think we have to be really thoughtful.
One idea in terms of being solution-based that has started being put around in conversation within the Alliance is sort of an idea that maybe aligns a little bit also with well, I'll leave that thought aside. But some protections for in-state ownership or some differentiation of privileges, protections isn't the right word, privileges allowed for in-state ownership that would include any new licenses coming in, that out-of-state would be restricted in some way. We haven't quite come up with a list, but that might be a mechanism that we can look at. We've talked a lot about guardrails, and speaking to those unintended consequences, any guardrails being put up, like small vetting for small percentage ownership, like you had said, Lucas, that actually I think makes things a little bit more challenging because employee benefits, actually that would be a great thing to be able to do things like that. And so some guardrails, like you said, Laura, I think create some intended consequences. But if we look at it the other way, where there are some strict prohibitions perhaps in place for out-of-state ownership, and then some privileges aligned with in-state ownership, there might be a pathway there for collaboration. I'm kind of curious, what I am hearing from other proponents, Lucas, is that this is a dire situation. Out-of-state ownership must be passed immediately, or else Washington state is going to be rendered irrelevant in the national market from this day forward, harming everybody, regardless of whether you got your license this year or you've had it for 10 years. I'm always skeptical of that level of intensity about anything. I think that, especially with big changes like this, it's beneficial to move slowly and deliberately. I'm kind of curious about thoughts from the whole group on that, about, is this an emergency that must be done to no matter who gets sort of steamrolled over in the process, or is this something that we can spend a little bit more time on to make sure that we get it right? Lucas, I said you could chime in here, and then Micah, I see your hand up too.
Yeah, so Laura, to your point of putting in guardrails, absolutely in favor of any sort of guardrails that can go in. And because like I said earlier, my whole thing is, how can we make this equitable for everyone that wants to participate, as opposed for those who have the means to get around the laws and rules? Because to me, that's not fair, and that's not how the laws were intended in Washington, right? And so I'm fully open to hearing any of those potential amendments to the current bill language that's out there, and most likely willing to get behind most of those. And as far as the urgency behind this, I think the urgency comes with the idea of federal decriminalization, which when federal decriminalization happens, there's the residency requirement would no longer be applicable. So the concern being is we have an ecosystem within the Washington state market of inability to have outside ownership but the moment we have federal decriminalization, we then gain constitutional rights, which was affirmed by the Brinkmeyer case with the Liquor and Cannabis Board. We would then effectively overnight gain constitutional rights, and therefore out-of-state ownership would be a given right within our industry. So if that were to happen and we didn't have this prepared, it's not then all Washington state companies are competing with interests that have a far greater backing. And you get the cookies, the steezies, the whatever that would be able to make their way into the state. So the rush or the concern is really, in my eyes, predicated upon federal decriminalization. And if that happens, I don't know when that will happen. But the concern is if we don't have our ducks in a row well before that and are able to not only get the capital, which isn't an instantaneous thing, but to be able to get the capital and then be able to infuse that capital into companies to be able to grow them for manufacturing, for brand development, marketing, whatever it is, to then be at a place where we're competitive with everyone else except for Alaska, that allows for out-of-state ownership to a certain degree. So as far as the urgency behind it, it's as urgent as we have federal decriminalization. And I would say 2 years with a 2-year running lead start would be ideal. 1 year to be able to gain capital, 1 year to be able to gain from the producer processor perspective, to be able to gain the ability to get new infrastructure, new machinery, new whatever, to better and more efficiently allow our businesses to function.
Yeah, Micah.
Great. Yeah, I'll answer your question quick and then just kind of circle back to a couple other points on this. So the other sort of timing thing that I've heard talked about is safe banking. If we're safe banking to go through, there would be an opportunity in that moment for money to come in from Washington state from like traditional investment that's thus far been outside of the cannabis industry almost entirely. So it would bring in a new round of capital that theoretically people want to take advantage of. So I've always been opposed to removing the limit on out-of-state ownership for a variety of reasons, some of which are really related to what Mike and Peter talked about, where the distribution of gains from this policy change is going to be towards certain types of businesses and away from others. And so were we to eliminate out-of-state ownership, a lot of the businesses that we run are not appealing to invest in from those sorts of sources. So for quite a lot of these businesses, there isn't really a lot of advantage to getting rid of it. And that's just the reality. Is large capital markets are not concerned with my rinky-dink business. In the same way that Mike and Peter expressed concern about like individual stores are not as appealing as chains of stores to invest in. And so there's going to be a disproportionate benefit to bigger, more organized firms that are ready to take advantage of the scale needed to invest. And this is true both in the workarounds that Lucas talked about and post removing this restriction. However, I'm at a point now where I don't believe that me or my business gets much of an advantage from this rule being in place any longer. My argument for many years was that we needed to make structural changes to the industry so that the economic reality of our existence right now was more evenly distributed, so that small businesses and big businesses were looked upon by out-of-state investors as appealing to invest in. And just to be frank, like we're still not at a point where that is true. There are only certain business models in this industry that are profitable. Those are going to be the ones that are going to get money, and they're going to be the ones that have further advantaged by that. And that's just like the regulatory reality that the Liquor Control Board has left us with, due to the fact that they haven't made any substantial changes to the structure of the industry in the entire time that we've been doing this. I always held the position that we need to make certain changes, more paths to market, more ability to get our products in front of customers, more ability to engage directly with customers. Lots of different things need to be done to make our industry evenly distributed as far as like who's making choices about price, quality, values, all of these things that are right now decided by a very particular supply chain that's set up in a very particular way to serve the interests of a very particular group of people. And that hasn't changed. So I'm sort of supportive of this passing because I don't think that it matters on the ground. And I think that it's a legislative distraction that prevents us from doing things that actually do matter. And so that's kind of where I'm at with this bill at this point, whereas I think like passing it is not going to make much of a difference one way or the other because all of this shit is already happening. We already have chain stores that have 10, 15, 20 locations. We already have giant conglomerates of farms that have 15 licenses on one piece of property that are managed all as a group. All of this shit already occurs. It's hard to get access to the advantages of that. You do have to bend some rules and have to be willing to do it or have the lawyers ready to like argue the case. And so, you know, this topic to me is like a couple of bad options are our choices. And we can pick bad option A or we can pick bad option B. And for me at this point, getting this issue off the table and out of the way is more important than preserving it because I don't think that it any longer benefits us. You know, we used to have 1,200 unique producers. Now we have what, 300 or 400? So the like variety of people that are participating in the industry is much less than it was 5 years ago when I was arguing very heartily, you know, forcefully against this policy because I wanted to see changes get made that made the industry better and healthier before this occurred. That still hasn't happened, and that's incredibly disappointing. But at the same time, I don't really see a path to you know making substantial changes that are going to address the sort of concerns that I've had. And I think moving this issue off the table and getting ourselves free for like the 2025 legislative session, which is so far away, to actually do some things that make a material difference in the lives of our businesses, which we desperately need. So that's where I'm at with it. Is I don't like this bill. I don't want it necessarily to pass, but at the same time, I'm willing to see that it does for other reasons.
So, and before I pass it over to you, Peter and Mike, this has been hotly debated, and I'll be curious to hear answers. Micah, then is this an opportunity to examine some of those other needs to say, hey, fine, let's do this while we are also addressing some of these other issues? We've heard
if we had a functional legislature,
be like,
sure.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I didn't hear you.
If we had a functional legislature that could do something that complicated, I would say yes, but we don't.
Okay, that's fair. Mike and Peter.
We have a low battery here at the location we are,
and we are wrapping up. So sorry.
Yeah, no, just in case we got disconnected, and we don't have the C connector for the Mac anyway. I have a question just to get some clarity. As far as I'm hearing, be prepared for federalization, legalization. So I guess I'm just want to understand more clarity on, say next week, President Joe Biden, he said, okay, cannabis is legal federally, right? So, but obviously we're not quote unquote prepared. So I guess I'm just trying to understand what is the issue there, or what's because if it becomes federal legal, right, then that means, okay, out of state can come in, or am I wrong? Or I'm just trying to understand.
Yeah, so the moment that a few decisions are made, it's really triggered. The DEA could issue something, Congress could issue something, the executive branch could issue an order to decriminalize cannabis. And it could even, well, anyway, they could issue that. And overnight, we gain constitutional rights. And the Dormant Commerce Clause, which is constitutional law, which is far-fetched and based on court cases, would then make it so any U.S. citizen would have the ability to invest in any U.S. company, and residency requirements are right out the door. This was just affirmed in the Tennessee Spirits case, which Tennessee had a residency requirement tied to ownership of a distillery. And that was a federal court case that set precedent for a very akin industry. And it stood up. I believe there's also something in Massachusetts very similar to the Washington state law that where Washington went this way and said, no, we don't have constitutional rights as Washington cannabis businesses. And then in Massachusetts, it went the other direction of, no, you're U.S. citizens, you have constitutional rights, your business has constitutional rights. And then the Dormant Commerce Clause went into play, and then there was a free allowance of out-of-state ownership in any way, shape, or form. So it's a hairpin trigger, but it's and who knows when it'll happen.
And just for more clarity, like another question on that. So if it could potentially happen without us doing anything, why do we need to do anything? And I know you're saying like prepare, but prepare in what way? Like,
so if you have so from a producer processor perspective, a lot of P's there. We're looking at dealing with farms in California that don't have canopy limitations. We're going to be dealing with Colorado being our sister state coming on live at the same time. And who knows if how transportation will work through states that don't have legal cannabis or however that works. But we're dealing with entities that have had the backing. Let's say it's to get the big BHO extractor, and that BHO extractor is 10 times more efficient than the $100,000 BHO extractors that we can afford in our state. Well, if that company is able to then sell their products at a greater margin in other states, it's going to be very challenging for Washington state companies to stay on board with that. The same thing comes with like right now, Harmony, we're trying to find biomass when it's dry out, and we don't necessarily have the funding to be able to purchase enough biomass. So what if there's another company that can come in and write a check for $1 million because they have the capital backing and to be able to come in and purchase the biomass, take it away from Washington state companies, and be able to put it in their big BHO extractor, be able to sell it for a cheaper margin than any of us could ever hope for. I'm a little daft when it comes to the woes of retail, but my big thing is if we're able to get ready ahead of time, hopefully we can get the capital to increase our capabilities to get that big BHO extractor, to be able to afford to purchase biomass, to be able to whatever it is, even if it's just bringing in IP. How we have to do that ahead of time so we don't have a situation where we're scrambling to get that initial capital where other entities from out of state have that capital and are able to come in and steamroll us. Because most of us are, at least in the producer processor side, we're like 3 months away of bad sales and to not existing. I know things are tight here at Harmony. So if that's the case and we have someone come in and buy up the biomass and then we can't turn and burn the way that we're used to, we're going to start seeing companies like Harmony start to go to the wayside. So that's the preparation aspect.
Thank you, Lucas, for answering that. I know we are well over time. Sean Dene has been pretty active in the chat, and I wanted to give her the opportunity. Yeah, I see Micah the comment on a couple of ways that federal legalization can happen, and I think to your question, Mike, I think it's depending on who pulls the lever and how it gets pulled is really dependent on that particular outcome. Sean, I want you to you brought up in the chat some backing of non-resident ownership to use funds to pressure a lift on canopy, expand number of licenses, and basically use their influence to change rules and laws to their benefit. And I think that right addresses concerns of how consolidation, which would come with out-of-state ownership, can bring pressures that we are not used to here yet in the state, and could experience some extreme price depression on the producer processor side.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I really need to add much to that, but I really do think that the non-resident topic gives us some negotiating power for those that don't want partnerships, don't want to sell out, that want to keep our nice small little cannabis businesses operating and funding our families, that we need some benefits, you know, like craft brewers get, like craft wineries get, like small business gets, like, you know, whether it's B&O tax exemption or license switching up the license fees, you know, making it much less for residents, much more for non-residents to balance that fiscal note. You know, I think there's a lot of things that we can pick at to benefit resident licensees, but I'm really, really concerned about the social equity applicants because you know, Peter and Mike, you are absolutely right. I mean, those of us that are small businesses that got in and you know, and we've been here for 10 years, we have a leg up on y'all, right? And if we allow big money from multi-state operators to come in, I'm just afraid it'll steamroll all the social equity focus that we've had so far in this state. And so it's a concern I have.
Thanks, Sean. Lucas, I see your hand up. And I'll
Thank
give
you.
you,
Yeah.
Lucas, by the way, the final thought, as we're well over time, but go right ahead.
Oh, I feel bad taking the final thought. No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I mean, there's the protection of taking inactive licenses and any sort of protections that we give to in-state residents and out-of-state ownership. We can set those in place, but at that moment of federal decriminalization, those will have to be expunged. So if we wanted to put protections in for residents and non-resident ownership, we would have to create those in a way where they'd be a benefit and acknowledge that there will be a time where there's going to be a sunset on that. So it's not a bad idea, but as we build that in, to just be very cognizant that those would not stand after a federal decriminalization of some way or another.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I kind of lied. That was a final thought on that particular subject, but thank you all for your time. I apologize, Lara. Lara had to drop off for other commitments. I had promised everybody 1:15, but this is such a great discussion. I want to thank all of you for your participation. Does anybody have any sort of general final thoughts about this upcoming session, hopes and dreams, before we move on?
Just Peter had to step away. I just want. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, he turned his phone off. It's like an echo. I just wanted to say thanks for inviting us here, and yeah, we appreciate the dialogue. And as you know, at Black Access Cannabis, you know, we're solution based, fighting for equity and inclusion, and we appreciate Cannabis Alliance's support on Senate Bill 5080, and obviously continue to support social equity. And we just, yeah, we want to work with everybody, you current stakeholders, as we're hopeful to be future stakeholders, and you know, something that was stolen from us years ago. But yeah, just want to thank you for allowing us to be here today.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank
Mike.
you for being here.
Yeah. And I'm just going to echo that sentiment. If I have any hopes or dreams for this upcoming session, is that we as an industry find clearer pathways to collaboration outside of the hearing room, so that we can come with a more unified and powerful voice, so that we're not so much arguing amongst each other, but really holding the legislature accountable for the decisions that they've made, and in turn, how that then plays out in the regulatory system throughout the year. We are always stronger together. And so thanks for being here. Here at the Cannabis Alliance, we are dedicated to the advancement of a vital, ethical, equitable, and sustainable cannabis industry. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you.